from the Psych Hub Podcast Network.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to the Burnout Antidote, infusing well-being into healthcare culture. This is Paul Dager, and I have my co-host standing by.
Hi, everyone. It's Amy Pearlman.
Amy, good to be back with you again, having a conversation today, which is going to be about managing healthcare workplace and personal stress. We're sort of looking at the two halves of our life and how it creates a whole that can maybe sometimes be a whole lot of too much.
I think this one really resonated for me, Paul, really thinking about, are these really two halves? And it doesn't feel so rigid or so black and white. And this between work and home is I'm still me at both places and I'm still a human.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't always let go of stress at one place or the other, which I think really comes more when there are things going on in one place or the other. I like to have one place together. And sometimes life does not follow that recipe.
Doesn't agree, yeah. Well, in that sense of how permeable is that wall between the two, and sometimes we don't have control over that. I think given this whole topic of the podcast, it's also important that we identify today is talking about stress, which is different than moral distress and burnout and trauma. There's a relationship between all of those, but today's focus is going to be about stress and stressors and from our personal side of life and how, as you said, there's just one me, even though we're looking at two halves of how we function.
Thanks, Paul. I really like kind of making that differentiation between the longer term burnout that seems more sustained over time and stress that feels more acute, kind of comes and goes to some extent.
Okay, I think it's a good way to set it out. Awesome. We have two stories today, and the first one is from Daniel, who is an internist. And then we have a story from Paul, a different Paul, who I believe he's a respiratory doctor or pulmonologist. So we get to hear their stories about workplace stress.
For the question of managing workplace stress and how it affects my personal stress, I think the most challenging thing is understanding that healthcare is a uniquely stressful environment. And I think what it boils down to is that it's an environment where almost all of the employees at all times and all the people that interact with the healthcare environment are being dehumanized in one way or the other. I think we all kind of fit a role when we go to work, whether that be the doctor or the nurse, or if you're being treated in the system, the patients. And our interactions are based on that role that we fit, and we don't always feel how we fit the role. So there are times when I just want to be myself and kind of not have to be the objective doctor and be more emotional and be more empathic in a sense than less rational and logical. And that can be really challenging because that's not necessarily my job description and my role in the system. And when I go to work, I realize sometimes that I'm not the only one affected by this dehumanizing system that we work under. All the people around me are being dehumanized at the same time. And so I can think of a lot of examples, but one that really sticks out to me was when I was in training and I was a resident. So I was a doctor in training, and I fit the role at the time of the resident doctor. I had a patient who I had to send to the ICU who was very sick, and they were on the wards or the general hospital floors. And so I called down to the charge nurse, the head nurse of the ICU, to call and ask if there are beds available and see how quickly I can get this patient down to the ICU. And I called, and the ICU was very busy. And the charge nurse at the time just said, you need to call the house supervisor, and you should know this and not call me, okay? And hung up. But what she didn't realize is that when she hung up, she actually had left the phone on. And then I overheard heard her say to her colleagues, all these stupid residents, like they don't follow the rules and they can just bypass things. And I remember just feeling this, because I was trying to do what I thought was the right thing for the patient. I just felt this boiling frustration that had been building up, and finally it came to a head, and I decided, I need to talk to this person who was a charge nurse that day with this person, face to face, and just ask and tell her that is not appropriate to talk to me that way. And so I went down, and I walked kind of angrily down, to the ICU. And, I confronted her in person, and she was in front of her colleagues too, but I tried to pull her aside and I said, hey, look, it's not appropriate for you to talk to myself or other residents that way. Please, like, if there's a problem, you also are more experienced, you can educate me. And I was looking at her, she was about to respond, all of a sudden she boiled over and started crying, just started bawling, crying, and walked away and didn't say anything. And it was a moment when I first started realizing, when I was in training, that I'm not the only one that feels that sense of frustration, and that I'm being pushed around, and that we're all coming to work with an incredible amount of stress in just normal interactions that seem like minutiae, and the details of the day-to-day are very antagonistic to each other. And I think that creates this very difficult working environment wherever you, regardless of what institution you work in healthcare. And I think I have come to realize that sometimes the stress level is so high in this dehumanizing environment that we impose stress onto each other. And sometimes it takes, taking a step back and realizing that you're not alone, and communicating that to those around you, whether it be a provider in whatever role they are in nursing, in therapy, and as a medical doctor, or to the patient who's experiencing the same feelings, the same kinds of negative interactions, sometimes even by myself inadvertently. I would say that's kind of a good example of how I have started to cope a little more proactively with my personal stress level in a healthcare system that's very stress inducing and dehumanizing at its core.
My name is Paul Hutchison, and I'm a pulmonary and critical care physician at Loyola University Medical Center outside of Chicago. And I've been asked to tell a story about managing stress and maintaining a work-life balance. So I'm going to tell you about Popcorn Movie Night. This is a special weekly event at my house that actually started during the pandemic, which for many clinicians, the pandemic completely threw off any balance between work and personal life that they had been able to achieve. Movie theaters, restaurants were shut down. People were suspicious of everyone's, quote, bubbles that somehow was supposed to indicate how careful they were being. Basically, you were stuck at home with your immediate family. And for me, my wife was trying to manage 3 small boys while I was working longer hours in a really high-risk environment. I'm going to be honest, this was a struggle. My wife's perspective was that every other family on the block benefited from both parents working from home, which really helped with the stress of childcare. My wife was also working part-time from home as she usually did, but now had less help to manage 3 rowdy boys with no outlet and less help. The stress at home actually rivaled for me the stress of caring for COVID patients in the intensive care unit. So one day during a casual conversation with one of our neighbors, my wife learned about Popcorn Movie Night, something that the other family had started doing. It was as simple as picking a G-rated movie from Netflix, and I can tell you there are a million of these, and actually a bunch of them are pretty good. Serving everyone pizza, so there was no stress about meal planning on a Friday night, and then cooking fresh popcorn on the stove, served in giant movie theater-sized popcorn buckets, usually with a bunch of Sour Patch Kids and M&Ms mixed into the popcorn. The movie started at 5, whether or not I was able to make it home, but that's what Friday nights look like. So once I did get home, though, and once I still get home on Friday nights, the phones go down. And occasionally I'm on call, so once in a while I do have a page to return, but that's the only technology that is permitted outside of TV and Netflix. We sit together as a family, the boys aren't fighting, and usually they're actually rotating on the couch between my wife and I, snuggling and sharing their popcorn. So this sounds really simple, but it is. There's nothing fancy about this dedicated time we spend together. You could argue that more interpersonal engagements, sitting playing board games or playing cards, would help us relate to each other better, or that more screen time really isn't the solution to managing stress at home or at work. But it's not the movie or the disengagement that relieves stress for me. For me, Popcorn Movie Night serves 2 purposes. First, being disconnected from work even for 2 hours is a nice break. And second, for me, that physical interaction with my kids is really special, and I'm able to really focus on them even for a short period of time. There's a lot of laughing, a lot of tickling, a lot of hugging. I maintain a connection to them that I just don't get during the day, and they're reminded that they're the most important parts of my life. Since we've started Popcorn Movie Night, my perspective on my work-life balance has shifted a lot. Of course, work is important to me because I have an obligation to my patients. I took an oath to care for them to the best of my ability. Every clinician has. But I also took a vow when I got married, and I promised that my faith and my family would come first in my life. So I sort of have these two competing obligations and commitments. So how do I reconcile those? So what I've decided is that I'm going to pour everything I have into my work when I'm there, and then I'm going to do the same thing when I get home, even if I'm exhausted. I've made the conscious decision that relative value units, RVUs, aren't going to be the measure of my success in my career. I've made career choices where I've probably left things on the table, possibly left research projects on the table that might have improved my standing or my academic reputation. And I've chosen an employer who probably pays me less, but allows me a little more flexibility that I have now compared to what I would have if I were in private practice making more money. At the end of the day, I have to make trade-offs. I know that. And trading off doesn't mean that I approach any part of my life with any less effort or focus. But there's only so many hours in the day, which means that how I shift my time between work and family has to reflect my priorities. So that when I look back on how I approached any period of my life, I want to be able to say, I'm really happy that I spent this much time with my family or that I put this much time into my work. It means that I can't bite off more than I can chew at work. And I think that's been the defining feature of my balance. And then at home, I need to be honest with my wife and my kids about how many sports teams I can coach and how many long weekends we can take to travel. There has to be a balance. Sometimes the balance is thrown off and I pay the price in increased stress. Not sure it ever gets to moral injury, and I really don't think it's gotten to the point of burnout. You'll have to ask my wife that, but I think that it's usually just in the form of increased stress. And even though the balance is rarely in that sweet spot, I continuously reassess my commitments, and that helps me maintain a quality of life that actually reflects my values and my priorities.
I really love listening to these stories because it feels like it brings to life what it is we're talking about. And there's this idea that some of this work, and when we do the literature reviews, it feels so academic. But when people tell us their stories, I feel it more in my heart. And I feel more like I know what that feels like, or I've been there, or I feel the struggle in a different way in my body that I'm aware of. So I really appreciate how much people have kind of partnered with us on this journey to dig in deeper.
Yeah, I mean, you and I could talk all week. We can quote this study and that data, but to hear these stories, I agree, it gets you right in the chest. And especially the first one, what I really heard is, thinking back, I know we're talking about moral distress, but I think that the burnout symptoms still play a role here, and that dehumanizing part really speaks to depersonalization and like getting stuck in roles. And I want to commend the first person, how even though I see him like marching on down there and wanting to be treated right, when he saw the humanity of that charge nurse, his humanity stepped up and responded. That was a beautiful thing to hear.
I agree. And I think it kind of goes back to you never know what's going on in someone else's life. And sometimes when you're feeling stress or moral distress or burnout or any of these words, it's really hard to see that humanity. And I loved how he kind of blended this idea, which to me feels like a strong sense of kind of injustice at the beginning.
Right.
Really,
that's a good word for it. Yeah.
Yeah, really moving into a collective sense of what this is like in the community. And I think the point in time that happened in his career during his residency was also very important, because I start thinking about how we've talked about this before. You don't learn all of these things as part of your education. So his ability to understand the distress in his own experience and then watch distress with a colleague as well. And then you think about how that, if that happens earlier in your career, there's this ability to expand that going forward into how you respond when stress comes up.
Yeah, it really helped to, I think, form him as how to be a human and a clinician. And it's funny, the word tribalism comes to mind in the sense of initially he was looking out for him and his other residents. And there's a certain amount of, I got to look out for my gang. And he was still even a step beyond that when it was like nurses versus residents. And then he was able to drop that role too and just come back to this common sense of being human. And I know when I'm stressed, I sometimes revert to these parts of myself rather than my whole self. And so I just think about this idea of home life and how sometimes that can spill over. You step in the door, whether it's virtual, figurative, or on the unit or on the floor, and the more stressed we are, we kind of go to these sort of corners of ourself or these sort of tribal identities, as opposed to, hey, we're all trying to do the best we can here today.
And I started thinking about this concept of doing versus being, of kind of
Okay. Yeah.
spending some time thinking about what's the action to take versus how do
Yeah.
I interact. And I want to
Mm-hmm.
tie that into kind of the second story we heard,
Yeah. Yeah.
where I think sometimes doing can be helpful. So, this idea of having this concrete time with family is
Yeah.
something that he could do. And that clinician could kind of make this action item to do list. This is on my calendar. I do it all of the time. And that
Right.
that doing really did affect his being. Whereas this sense of intention and doing in the second
That's the
story,
word. Yeah.
where the first one was more of a reaction and doing. And I can relate to both of those. There were
Yeah.
some parts in this episode that just kind of feel kind of close to home, um, both in work and at home. And as a
Mm-hmm.
parent, thinking about my family and how does a tough day at home affect work, and also when I have a tough day at work, how does that affect how I can be present for my family? And
Yeah.
I I related to that one in a way that there were times where I felt, I don't even really want to talk about this again because I don't feel like I've mastered this one at all.
Oh, I don't know if mastery we ever get there.
I know, but
But
that might be on my to-do list, Paul.
okay.
Master the work-life
Mastery.
balance.
Good luck on that. But the word that I was thinking even before you said it was intention. And that popcorn, one, first of all, popcorn movie night just sounds fun just to
I
say it. So,
know.
but how there was a sense of, well, the other thing I heard about was values. He started to look at, what do I really value? And there's a tool from ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, the 80th birthday exercise, where you imagine it's your 80th birthday and you look back and like, what were you happy about? What did you feel like you missed out on? And I heard he kind of did that he didn't want to look back and realize he missed out on his kids and family. So bringing that intentionality into popcorn movie night, that idea of when we're making these tough decisions, I think values and what's important is a good place to start.
I love that. As someone who kind of considers my professional life pretty mission or values driven, and I think a lot of
Yeah.
us in healthcare really feel that way. How do we think about not just our own professional vision, but our personal vision, and who do we want to be, and how do we want to do that? Gets you that balance of doing and being.
Us healthcare clinicians are driven to heal and help others. At PsychHub, we offer a wide variety of content that can support your well-being, help you find new creative and evidence-based ways to practice, and get inspired again. Whether you want to better understand depression, or you're interested in providing trauma-informed care, or you want to learn about navigating grief, our vast library of educational content has you covered. PsychHub offers curated continuing education learning opportunities on a variety of timely and relevant mental health topics and evidence-based interventions, geared specifically toward healthcare and mental health providers. These custom learning programs will empower you to support better mental health for patients, colleagues, and yourself. Learn more about our evidence-based mental health education opportunities at psychhub.com.
You have to admit, because I've heard about personal mission statements, that always felt to me like work crossing the line into home. But it does sound like it can be done in a way that's authentic and real. So that's what I heard coming through that second story. And also, I think the other thing that I really, again, we talked about it's one person and two halves. He did do some wall down the middle, but this idea of wherever he is fully there. And I think there's something to be said for that. Compartmentalizing can be a stress management tool with upsides and downsides, but I'm hearing for him, he's leveraged it in a way where he can be fully present and engaged. And if we think about one of the symptoms of burnout is loss of purpose or accomplishment, I'm hearing that his approach helps with that he's fully there when he's with the family and he's fully there when he's at work.
I love that. And I started to think about this piece of how we are real, even when I was describing kind of being there in a personal sense and doing that for my family and being there at a work sense for patients or clients or individuals or families, whatever we call them, but really missing from both of those pieces. When are you really present with yourself? So I'd like to think about it maybe less as half and half and more of a pie chart of some sort.
I'm thinking blueberry pie right
now. I know. I was going to give a metaphor of some kind of...
Which pie are you going to go with here? Yeah, and it's, as I've pondered about this episode today and kind of our whole bigger picture, and I'm going to keep going back to Tekla because I just found her wisdom keeps resonating with me as we listen to these stories, and how I noticed the 3 symptoms of burnout actually align with the practices of self-compassion. And that really came to me listening to these stories. So emotional exhaustion seems like a good time to call upon mindfulness and honor that exhaustion. And the depersonalization, well, we heard how this sense of common humanity that we're all suffering here together. And then for the loss of purpose, I think self-kindness, because to me, when we start to feel loss of purpose, we probably get kind of, unkind to ourselves. Like, what good am I doing here? Why am I here? And I just found that really helpful to start aligning almost like symptoms and solutions, but I almost hate to get too techie in that way. But like there's a response or antidote. Maybe that's the word.
Oh, I like it.
Do you like that?
Good theme.
When I'm feeling a particular symptom of moral distress, there is an antidote that comes out of the 3 parts of self-compassion.
And I love thinking about things in terms of the 3s as well. So now I've got my pie divided up. We just need to find our third person to split it.
Okay, that's a lot of pie though.
It is a lot of pie. Maybe it's a mini size one.
Okay.
I started thinking about this kind of in terms of like pillars of how do we pull these pieces together. Or maybe we'll go with the pie theme and there'll be ingredients to think about what do we want to put in so that you get...
Mixing metaphors.
I know, right? It's too many metaphors. Next thing we need to do is to add a song. But that might be going too far. But I really
that might be too much.
Think this sense of there's a natural instinct in healthcare that may make us more vulnerable or more susceptible to these.
Well, okay, let me ask, do you mean the environment or the individuals drawn to it when you say that?
I was actually thinking more about the individuals that are drawn to kind of what we think of as almost these helping professions. And then the environment that has I like pulling it into the environment as well, because I think that the environment to some extent has almost taken advantage of people who put others first. And the longer you put others first and others first and others first, the more acceptable it becomes to lose kind of the individual humanity component of it.
Good point,
I think about that in terms of efficiencies or in terms of things that come into play with how can we do this better without, maybe that's the doing and being again, but how can we do this better without thinking about what the impact is of that is on the being?
Okay. Well, in the environment piece, like the very nature of this work is exposure to human suffering. And I think it is a certain kind of person drawn to that. Our hearts get touched and we feel that calling. I did see one study where it talked about, it measured the sense of calling and then the lack of self-care. There was an inverse relationship of putting yourself last. So I think you're onto something, that there needs to be some balance here.
I agree. I think balance becomes even harder. Well, maybe it gets easier with like a 3-legged stool if you think about it that way. I started thinking about it as
stated.
balancing or juggling 3, and
Yeah.
not a juggler, but 3 feels harder than 2. But with a stool, 3 can
stable.
be more stable, right?
Stable on any surface. There you go.
There we go.
And we all know the stuff to do to take better care of ourselves. Maybe eat a little better, move a little more, sleep a little better, meditate a little. But how do I think coming back to that word intention, that if I'm doing that because it's on a to-do list, it probably won't have much of an effect. If I do it out of the sense of, I deserve this and I need this, I think it's more likely to have an impact.
I think that gets into like the integration component as well. And
Yeah.
I remember at an old job I had, I ran into the CEO at a place picking up lunch one day, and I asked him, he had just had his second kid, and I asked him, how do you do it? How do you balance work and home? And he said, I no longer think of it as balance. I think about it as integration. And that was a while ago. And it has stuck with me in terms of kind of the pros and cons of integration. But this idea of if having this core humanity and thinking about where you put it, one or the other. But then in the example that we had around being truly present, I think integration can sometimes get in the way.
Well, there's so much to think and unpack here. And I think what's coming to mind, it's actually an approach. So remember, I used to be a physical therapist, and chronic pain is one area that I delved in. Yeah. And I remember I think there's something to be gleaned here and applied from the approach on chronic pain. Because with chronic pain, by definition, it's going to be there. And it does vary in its intensity. And the approach is, when you wake up in the morning, you check in. And where is my condition at today? And if it's, you're able to do, if you're feeling a little better, then you can take on a little more that day. And if you're feeling a little worse, then you need to set some boundaries and set some limits and step back. So I think there's something here around personal stress and a morning check-in. Where am I at today? And use that in guiding the decisions for the day. And there's stuff you have to do, especially if you're a parent as well as work. But then there's extra stuff that I think we take on, sometimes out of a knee-jerk obligation or reaction. And with this morning check-in, I can determine what are my have-tos and what are my, I have it and I can do it today versus, you know what, not today. And I'm okay with that.
I really like that. And I like the idea of really putting emotional pain onto the same, validity and reality of that spectrum for how you would respond to physical
Same brain
pain,
networks.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That feels like an offering, I think, to our listeners that they can play with and make it their own this week.
I like that. And I think there is this idea that I think of as well as we think of all of these tools, that no one is really going to pick all of these tools and say, hey, this is going to work for me all of the time. But the more tools we can put out there and the more ways to respond is the more options or opportunities for people to try them out, see what works for them, and then decide what works going forward.
Amy, I'm seeing a theme in when you support people.
Oh,
yeah, which I love it as far as, well, it actually, it comes out of a mindfulness approach, and don't take my word for it. And like, you and I, I'm using air quotes, experts. I think we're learners more than experts in this journey. But just because we say it a certain way doesn't mean you can't modify it and adapt with it and experiment. So run the experiment. When I teach meditation, I'm always like, yeah, here's an idea, run with the experiment and then make it your own. And that's the theme I hear from you these past couple of weeks is, run the experiment, make it your own.
I think that resonates for me. I'll just leave it that way.
Cool. Okay. I'm going to give you credit for it, whether you accept it or not.
All right. Sometimes other people see these patterns in you before you see them yourself.
True. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. See you again next week.
See you, Amy. Bye.
If you'd like to reach us, you can do so at podcast@psychhub.com. To be notified of new episodes, don't forget to like, subscribe, or follow wherever you're listening. And reviews are so helpful, so please do leave one if you can. It allows others to find us and to join along. The Burnout Antidote is executive produced and edited by Jacob Morrison. Research is assisted by Tekla Ross. Show artwork was created by Ornella Jangoli and Ashton Smith. A very special thanks to Juliana Castro, Alyssa Fackler, Trevin Stiegel, Andrea Womack, and of course, our pet, Pickles. The Burnout Antidote is a co-production from Psych Hub and is brought to you by Janssen Neuroscience.